After we're done laying our transects, the next thing you would do in a habitat survey is to establish what's called Bankfull. Bankfull is basically like where the water fills up through the entire riverbed, and it's the point at which it's full to the brim on the bank, and if it gets any fuller, it will spill over the outside onto the floodplain shown there. So you can kind of think of it like a bathtub, where Bankfull is the point at which the water is full to the very brim of the bathtub. Now, finding Bankfull is not super easy. You kind of have to have an eye for it. It's something you develop over time. It's also not something that you can find from one particular spot in the river. So typically when you do a habitat assessment, as you're pulling transects, as you're laying out transects, you're also trying to establish Bankfull as you're walking upstream. I chose this location because this is probably the easiest indicator of Bankfull on this system that I'm at right now. So you can see across the stream there's that really nice line where the bank is at. So that represents a change in slope, which is one of the primary ways that you can tell where Bankfull is. So it's basically, and there's one down here too. So we have Bankfull, you can see it's pretty steep where that moss is and below. But when it gets right to about there, that's when it's going to spill over onto the bank. And so that kind of elevation right there, right above the tree roots, is your Bankfull elevation. So a couple other indicators of Bankfull elevation are also a change in vegetation as well. So if we pan over to the other side, we can see that right along that Bankfull line is where we get all of those ferns, little shrubs, things like that. And that's a good indicator too that that's a Bankfull line. Most of the time, most terrestrial vegetation is not going to survive very well below that Bankfull line. You might get some moss and some grasses and things like that depending on your system. Those are really water-loving, or they can be water-loving species. And so sometimes you might get some green stuff, but you're typically not going to get like full-fledged trees and stuff like that below your Bankfull line. With the exception, I guess, of willow. Sometimes willow does, but typically it's going to be a much greater increase of vegetation above that Bankfull line as opposed to below it. Another good indicator of Bankfull is change in sediment size. So here I'm at a spot of the river that's really low, and we have our Bankfull elevation up here at the top, kind of wraps around and goes upstream. You can see that change in slope, but there's also a change in sediment size. So you can see down below, underneath where the Bankfull line is, we get really large sediment there. That shows that the water moves through there pretty quickly on a regular basis, and that's why it's able to wash away any fine sediment, and this is what's left over. So you typically get coarse sediment below the Bankfull elevation, whereas when you go at or above the Bankfull elevation, that's when you get more like dirt. It becomes bank material, so it's fine sediments, finer particles, and that is another indicator of Bankfull. Here's another great example of Bankfull, so you can kind of see from this perspective that we have, some duck friends. We have this line of pretty consistent elevation. And again, it's not like a stair step. So this is a natural system. There's going to be nooks and crannies and stuff like that. So you kind of have to get a general idea instead of just like it's not going to be super exact. You kind of have to like squint your eyes and kind of see the bigger picture. One other thing to note is it's really helpful to look on one side of the river as well as the other side of the river. So we can see here on this right side of the river, we have an undercut bank, and the bottom of that undercut bank is just about the same elevation as the top of this bank on the other side. And that's a really good indicator too. When you get two Bankfull indicators that match up on either side of the river, that's a really good indication that that's a good sign that that's Bankfull. Now with undercut banks, you have to be a little tricky. Sometimes they erode and kind of collapse. They're not always at Bankfull elevation, so they're not the best Bankfull indicator. But this example here looks to be about Bankfull elevation to me. If you reach your hand underneath there, all of this area below my depth rod is just air. So that's where the undercut bank is. And again, that matches up with the other side of the river. Point bars can also be good places to look for Bankfull indicators, but you have to be a little bit careful. So one of the temptations is that people want to call Bankfull elevation here at the top of the point bar because it's flat and there's not really a lot of change in substrate size right there. But this is actually part of the active channel. So the fact that it's loose, it's gravelly, there's no vegetation on it, those are all indications to me that that's not Bankfull right there. And also it's much, much lower than our other Bankfull indicators. If you look closely here, there is a change in sediment size. So on this side here, we have pretty larger gravel, whereas on this side here we have a lot more dirt, sand, smaller gravel. So there's a line that kind of goes right here. That's also not Bankfull. That's probably just a line that the river normally comes up to in common flows. And then we have another here. So this is actually Bankfull there on the top of the bank. So the reason why I would call that Bankfull is because up above it, it's very, very flat, right? Also because when we have this line here, there's ferns and other vegetation above it. There's not a lot below it. There's some grass and some ivy, but again, that kind of happens sometimes. You got to take it according to kind of generalize, I guess. The other thing that kind of keys me in is that when I look on the other side of the river, there's an undercut bank there. And the bottom of that undercut bank is about the same elevation as the top of this bank on this side of the river. So that's also another good key and feature that our Bankfull elevation is actually up here and not down here. Here's an example of Bankfull that can often be confusing. And also, there's the same ducks. I keep chasing them upstream. So here we are at a point bar here. And you can see that there's a change in vegetation here on top of the point bar. And the temptation is to call Bankfull along this line of vegetation. But that doesn't look right to me. The reason why is because at other parts of the river, we called our Bankfull elevation quite a bit higher. That's significantly lower than where we call Bankfull elevation in other parts of the river. So you also have to be careful. And what's probably happening is if you look on the other side of the river, there's like this huge gnarl of brush. There's also some pipe there where excess water probably comes in. And so I would just kind of classify this as a weird part of the river, and this is probably not where I would look for the best Bankfull indicators at. So you have to be kind of choosy when you pick where to look at your Bankfull indicators. In this part of the river, the channel is really constrained, so it's a lot smaller than in other parts of the river. So if we look on the river left here on the left-hand side, there is a pretty high up moss line, but you have to be kind of careful with moss because it grows in wet and drier conditions as well. For me, I'd probably call Bankfull down here at this lower line, right below where those ferns are. That's most likely the Bankfull line here because you can see that well, it's kind of hard to see, but there is a change in gradient. So it kind of comes up on these rocks, it's covered with moss, not really a lot of else vegetation, and there's a pretty clear constant line of elevation right above those rocks. If we look on the other side of the river here, we can see something similar. So this side of the river has a bank, closer here, has a bank, and if you follow the bank line, it's a pretty much the same elevation as that other side, the change in elevation there. So one thing to note is that Bankfull is not going to be constant throughout your site. This area is a really constrained part of the channel. It's much skinnier than other parts of the river that we've been looking at Bankfull at. In places where the river is really constrained like this, it's going to increase the Bankfull elevation. You have the same quantity of water that's being squeezed into a smaller channel. That's going to increase the water height, which also increases the Bankfull height. So again, it's a hypothesis. You have to keep in mind that in areas where the river is really wide and shallower, it's going to have a lower Bankfull elevation, whereas in areas like this, where the river is really constrained and narrow, it's going to have a higher Bankfull elevation. You also want to avoid calling Bankfull on really tall banks like this. I know that it is a change in slope for sure, but it doesn't really match up with, it's too high for our other Bankfull elevations. So because we've seen so many other good Bankfull indicators that are a lot lower than that tall bank that we were just looking at here, I would not call this the Bankfull elevation. What tends to happen with these is that a lot of times this is an old Bankfull line and the river has moved, well, in this case, the river is moving towards the cut bank this way. And so these often, like nice steps here, can represent old riverbanks, and this is probably at one point in time the river is probably closer to this side, and that's probably why that exists. So you have to be kind of careful about that.